All of the apostles of Jesus died. There isn't much of a question there. But the ways in which they were martyred vary drastically. And this got me thinking, since some methods of martyrship were clearly more memorable than others, just how would these deaths stack up in one of those tier list videos? Just to get the obvious one out of the way, Judas is an easy D tier. Unlike most of the other apostles, who were killed by other people, as everyone knows, Judas took it upon himself, and he went about it in a manner that lacked creativity. And the only reason he is in an F tier is because there's another account that describes him jumping off a cliff into a field, where his intestines burst out upon impact. The majority of these deaths have multiple narratives, so their ranking will be based on which one I like the most. Now, for what is probably the most famous martyring of any apostle, St. Peter. During the crackdown on Christianity under Emperor Nero, Peter was among those executed. Instead of being crucified in the normal, upright fashion, Peter requested to be crucified upside down, because he didn't want to be killed in the same manner as Jesus. Being crucified to begin with is something I'd imagine is very painful, so voluntarily taking that added factor of being upside down would have taken some courage. Peter is definitely going to be an A tier. Next up is St. James. Out of all of the apostles' deaths, James was the first, which I think is worth something. He was executed with a sword on the orders of Herod Agrippa I, which isn't extraordinary in and of itself, but the fact that he pioneered the act of martyrship and was one of the only two apostles whose death was actually mentioned in the Bible is enough to land him comfortably in B tier. Paul is the apostle with the somewhat noteworthy distinction of not being a part of the original 12, but is still regarded as being an apostle by all major sects of the Christian church. His death, in my opinion, is pretty underwhelming. He's another one said to have been killed during Nero's reign, in the rather mundane fashion of beheading. It's just not that impressive compared to the other means of martyrship, and it's going in D tier. In a similar vein to Paul, Matthias wasn't one of the authentic 12 apostles either. He was just given the title because someone had to fill in for Judas. And there isn't as much information on Matthias, so you'd assume that he had a similarly mundane death, but you'd be mistaken, because he's the apostle who had the honor of being stoned to death by cannibals in what is modern-day Georgia. Phenomenal death right there. It's almost S tier. It's really close, but it's staying in A for now. Andrew the Apostle, the brother of Peter the Apostle, also had a special request for his crucifixion. Not wanting to die identically to Jesus, he asked to be crucified on an X-shaped cross, and to have his hands bound instead of being nailed. I can't say that this is as impressive as what Peter did, because in some ways this actually sounds like a less painful way to be crucified. Also, the whole concept of asking to be crucified a certain way was kind of Peter's thing. With a little more originality, Andrew could have gotten a higher rating. C tier. Jude, on the other hand, has one of the more down-to-earth deaths of the apostles. While working as a missionary in Syria, Jude commanded some demons to come out of the idols that they were hiding in, so the locals axed him to death. This is the reason why St. Jude is often depicted holding an axe, in the Christian tradition of forever being associated with the thing that killed you. It's honest, it's humble, it's going in B tier. One of the more obscure apostles, Simon the Zealot, spent a lot of time working with Jude the Apostle, and while Jude got a relatively quick death, one account from the 1500s describes Simon being sawed in half. And as you'll likely know, historically speaking, getting sawed in half was usually done vertically. Now, this might be a controversial decision, but the sheer amount of pain you'd have to go through and the length of the process makes this our first S tier martyrship. Let's talk about the other apostle named James. James, son of Alphaeus, and depending upon your interpretation, James the Just, was one of the, quote, brothers of Jesus. He was pushed off of a temple and then he was attacked with a fuller's club. Afterwards, he was stoned to death and buried beside the temple. This death is pretty nuanced, considering how much violence there was leading up to it. So, for that reason, I'm going to place it in B tier. Although it might be closer to C tier. It's kind of on the brink of being in C tier, but I feel like that's too low for how convoluted this one was. The death I'm using for Philip is coming from the axe of Philip, and it's a little derivative to say the least. So Philip is able to convert the wife of a proconsul to Christianity, and the proconsul decides to have Philip executed. The method of execution is, once again, upside-down crucifixion. The saving grace here is how Philip acted while he was dying. He continued to evangelize, and when the onlookers started to side with him, he refused to be brought down. Yes, this is definitely an uninspired method to get martyred in, but the way Philip took it is enough to land him in C tier. There's a lot less to talk about with how Thomas was killed. In fact, there's only a single account of his death. He was stabbed to death with a spear when he was touring India. It's definitely an unpretentious way to get killed, but it just feels too simple for me. D tier. Matthew, not to be confused with Matthias, is the apostle with the highest number of conflicting stories on how he was killed. Some say he was beheaded, some say he was killed with a halberd, some say he was stabbed to death, stoned to death, or even burnt to death. Yes, Matthew is the only apostle who may have potentially been burned to death, which is easily among the most painful ways you can die. And that's easily justification for putting him in A tier. While he was preaching in Armenia, Bartholomew became the victim of what is, in my opinion, the most memorable death of all the apostles. Nobody else even comes close, not even Matthias or Simon or St. Peter. He managed to convert the king of Armenia to Christianity, which enraged the king's brother, prompting a brutal execution. Bartholomew was flayed alive, and then he was beheaded. One version even describes Bartholomew being crucified first, and then getting flayed and beheaded. That is a remarkable death, and is going in S tier without a doubt. There's only one apostle left, and I've saved the worst for last. St. John the Beloved, unlike every other apostle, had the luxury of dying of old age. And as if that wasn't enough, he was 88 years old. It's pathetic. While everyone else was suffering to help spread Christianity, John was perfectly content being alive. And for that, he gets the honor of having the only apostle death in F tier. Do better. And there you have it, the quintessential ranking of how the apostles died. Now, I understand this might all seem to be a bit callous. I don't mean any disrespect to these historical figures or to the religion they represent. This was all in the name of good, clean fun. But having said that, it does seem undeniable that some of these martyrings were vastly superior to others.